A while ago, I decided I really wanted to build the Rockwell ATF, which was a concept aircraft discussed by Dan Raymer in his book, Living in the Future, in which he talks about his work as a conceptual aircraft designer working on various manned and unmanned vehicle projects for the military. The ATF, or Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, was developed by the Air Force to develop a next-generation air superiority fighter, one that would basically be a successor to the F-15. Rockwell's preliminary concept, designed by Dan Raymer, is described as sort of a supersonic F-117, but I sort of see it as a cross between a Su-27 and an F-14. To my knowledge, this airplane never left the drawing board, and it exists only in drawings and 3D renders, so I decided to make it RC. But anyway, I began sizing my RC model for a twin 64mm EDF setup because I was familiar and had some experience with these little motors. So this is a little bit about the modeling process that I used in SolidWorks to make this airplane. So the reason I wanted to model this airplane is because I knew I wanted to 3D print certain components of this airplane, such as the nose and the nacelle. I later realized that trying to 3D print an entire nose would have kind of been a pain, so I ended up only printing the nacelle. So that was one reason, and the other reason is I wanted to see how everything would look before I started making it, and it's really easy to do that on a computer. So I started by importing the top view and the side view of the actual aircraft drawings, and those were kind of the baseline sketches where I could base everything off of. Next, I decided to model a wing. I knew I wanted to make this out of foam board, so modeling it was pretty easy. I just kind of sketched the contour and made a very simple extrusion to represent the flat foam board wing that I would put on this plane. So after that was the more time-consuming part, which was the nose and the rest of the fuselage. And I started by modeling everything using boundary surfaces, which worked fairly well until I realized I needed to mirror it. And SolidWorks really doesn't like mirroring boundary surfaces when they're not perfectly perpendicular to the plane that they're being mirrored to. And so what I ended up doing is making a very thin boundary surface, and that provided like a clean kind of cut that I could mirror across. And so you can kind of see this in the final model, and that just kind of helped me make this entire surface into a solid a little bit more easily. So in the end, I was left with a nose that looked fairly realistic and ready to 3D print, so I initially thought, until I realized printing all the pieces would have been a huge pain in the butt, so I just ended up making it out of foam board instead, which is what you're about to see. Oh, but before we do that, I almost forgot to talk about the nacelles. So this airplane has two engines, and each engine has its own little housing or nacelle. And these are mounted on the bottom of the airplane. So first I modeled the little 64mm EDF units that I have, and once I had those in CAD, I could design the enclosure around it so it wouldn't take up any extra space. So these nacelles are basically two parts. There's a little thrust tube inside, which kind of constricts the flow out of the EDFs to make the flow a little bit faster, and that basically makes the entire airplane a little bit more efficient. And the other part is just the exterior housing, which is just meant to look nice and fairly representative of the CAD models and the drawings of this actual airplane that I had found online. Okay, that's enough CAD. So at the end of the day, the CAD was really only useful to kind of get an overall picture of how this plane was going to come together, and to generate the files for the nacelles, which I then 3D printed, and now it's on the actual build of the airplane. I began with the wing, freehanding the contour and cutting it out of foam. I made 3 of the same pattern and sandwiched them together with Gorilla Glue and left it to cure. For the canopy and nose section, I referenced a side view of the airplane, cut out the 2D profile, and glued it in place. Here's me just thinking about where all the components are going to end up, just for a preliminary center of gravity assessment. I then made the bulkheads, which define the frontal cross sections, and hot glued in foam board skins as the last step. The 3D printed nacelle components were next. These were all printed out of PLA and CA glued together, which made the parts quite rigid. It was then time for a quick little electronics test to verify that everything worked, which it did, and after making an impromptu battery hatch, it was time for a first flight. Okay, here goes nothing. While this airplane flew perfectly, I never had the opportunity to take it out more than twice. Around this time, my internship ended and I had to go back to school in SoCal, and there just wasn't enough room to lug this thing around everywhere. I mean, this thing is like 2 foam boards long, so it's almost as tall as me. And sadly, I did not have a good use case for this airplane, so I decided to scrap it. I cut up all the foam board and threw it away, and saved all the electronics. And some of those electronics are currently flying around in some of my more recent projects, such as this airplane, which you might see later. So yeah, thanks for watching, bye.